Batman Arkham Knight is an absolute disaster on Switch. There are a lot of problems here, but performance is by far its biggest flaw. In broad strokes, we're looking at sub 30 FPS frame rates, with near constant drops, especially during open world traversal. 20 to 25 FPS readouts are common as we glide above the city, with frame rates stabilizing somewhat once we're on the ground. That part is bad enough, but look at the frame time graph. The game suffers from frequent stutters, often over 100 milliseconds, with a lot of frame time variance. That means the game feels subjectively even worse than the top line frame rates would indicate, and you will briefly see Batman seem to jerk back in this footage every so often when the frame rates are dropping, which seems to be a byproduct of the camera continuing to move while Batman remains stationary for a frame. It feels a lot like the rubber banding effect players of some online multiplayer games might have experienced, like in older Battlefield titles. It gets worse. When we enter the Batmobile and engage in a high-speed chase here, the game takes an even bigger frame rate tumble, with a wildly inconsistent frame time readout. Arkham Knight is legitimately quite challenging to play here with all of the constant stuttering. It's hard to express how poor the game actually feels to control. A locked 20 FPS, for instance, would feel a lot better than this. I suspect the game's streaming systems are causing serious issues here. That's not all. We get the occasional super high frame time spike. This pause, for instance, lasts for over 2 seconds. These pop up pretty regularly if you just drive around the city for a bit, really pulling you out of the experience. And the game sometimes hangs at 0 FPS indefinitely, or at least it does when it crashes, which happened twice over the time I played Arkham Knight. The game needed to be manually closed here, which took a while. These glitches are an occasional painful reminder of the game's basic instability. Some sections of the game do run more acceptably. On-foot gameplay can sometimes hit and hold 30 FPS for extended periods. Indoor areas tend to run a bit better as well, though these can suffer from substantial frame rate issues at times. Basically, if you haven't got much of the city in view and you aren't moving very quickly, there's a decent chance you'll be at or near 30 FPS. But a lot of Arkham Knight's gameplay is just the opposite. Even if Arkham Knight was a visual match for its home console counterparts, its performance would render it impossible to recommend. But unfortunately, there are a wide range of graphical cuts here relative to last-gen home consoles, which make it an unattractive game as well as a jerky one. I think focusing on the micro detail is a good place to start. Look at this electrical panel here. Texture resolution is hugely degraded, we lose the high voltage and danger indicators and the reddish grime, and the material properties are simplified, without a specular sheen. The game is just barely recognizable here. This glass cabinetry loses almost all of its lighting detail, with zero shadowing whatsoever. And look at the glass, which has very nice shading on Xbox One, but appears to be totally transparent on Switch, a simplification which makes this scene look strange. We also see vast lighting differences and stripped back material properties when we look at this elevator. The bookshelf shot here effectively shows off another key cutback, the complete removal of ambient occlusion on Switch. Obviously, the Switch version looks much worse in these comparisons, but critically, I think it just no longer looks much like Arkham Knight. The moody, mechanical world of Gotham loses a lot of its character when most of the lighting detail has been stripped out, and textures and materials are harshly decimated. A lot of the same concessions are evident at a distance. At this angle, we can see just how deep the cuts can run, with extremely low resolution textures plastering the environment below. Distant geometry is pared back as well, which is noticeable if you run your eyes along the skyline here. Also see how the distant city geometry has been replaced with a row of simple, tall buildings, presumably as a performance-sparing measure. When we drive through the city, we see some pretty severe pop-in as a result of these LOD compromises. Looking down at street level, there's typically far less enemy commotion and traffic than before as well, which probably saves valuable CPU cycles. And the clouds in the sky have been greatly simplified. The bat signal texture remains, but is at a laughably low resolution. Also note the rain here. While it is present and looks perfectly fine, its volume has been reduced compared to Xbox One. Characters look much more basic, lacking much of the detail that we see on last-gen systems. Like the rest of the game, they lack shadow maps, instead featuring crude blob shadows at their feet. And the cutscene sequences have been cropped in somewhat with a tighter framing of the action. This may simply be another way the developers have tried to claw back a little bit of performance. The roiling, finely tessellated waves on last-gen home consoles have been pared back a lot on Switch, with the new water surface mostly getting by with the usual normal map tricks instead. The water is probably my favorite visual element from the other versions of this game, and this downgrade does hurt, though a big cut here was probably inevitable. Finally, the post-processing has been cut back. Depth of field looks a little bit worse, with less defined bokeh shapes. The most obvious cut here has to be the motion blur though, which has been completely stripped out of the Switch release. This is another visual element that really made the prior Arkham Knight releases look special, so its absence is deeply felt, especially during high-speed traversal. When driving, you'll also notice that the destructible elements often simply pop out of existence when hit too, with none of the physicalized debris that we saw on last-gen consoles. Resolution-wise, we're looking at an 810p res in docked play on Switch here, without dynamic res, which fares up okay against the 900p frame on Xbox One. There's no anti-aliasing on Switch, so it does tend to look somewhat rough around the edges. Image quality isn't great on Switch really, but the game has bigger issues. In portable play, the overall experience is substantially similar. Subjectively speaking, the performance is about the same, and visual settings seem largely unchanged except for resolution, which comes in at 540p. The game perhaps fares ever so slightly better as a portable experience, though it's still in very poor shape.